It seemed like the labor pains had started. As a first-time mom, I was filled with anxiety, especially since I was so far from my hometown and returning for the birth wasn't an option. Thankfully, my in-laws' house was just a 10-minute walk away, and with our good relationship, I planned to rely on them if needed. My due date was yesterday, and just as my husband left for work, I started feeling what I suspected were labor pains. I had just arrived at work, but I knew the baby wouldn't arrive immediately. I decided to keep an eye on things and let my husband know if anything changed. Despite my growing anxiety, my husband George seemed strangely indifferent. Reflecting on it now, I realized his behavior had been off for a while. My name is Ellie. At 32, I'm a full-time housewife, having left my job upon discovering I was pregnant. George, who is 2 years older than me, was a senior at the university I attended. We reconnected at a university club gathering 3 years ago, and our chemistry was immediate. Given our age, we decided to marry soon after. I was thrilled to marry while still in my late 20s. George's demanding job often keeps him late or requires him to work on his days off, which only heightens my anxiety. Fortunately, my mother-in-law has been a tremendous support, especially during the rough patch of morning sickness. She's eagerly anticipating the arrival of her grandchild, and I want to ensure a healthy delivery for her sake. My father-in-law has also been incredibly helpful, driving me to the hospital when needed. I'm truly blessed with such wonderful in-laws. Yesterday was my due date, and my anxiety spiked as I noticed no signs of labor starting. I voiced my concerns to George before he left for work, but he seemed irritated and hurried. If the labor pains haven't started, it means it's not time yet. There's no point in overthinking it. The baby will come when it's ready, he said dismissively before heading out. I wasn't asking for him to do anything specific. I just wanted him to understand and empathize with my anxiety. We had this argument several times during my pregnancy, with George insisting that overthinking won't change anything and that things will work out in their own time. Maybe he's right, but giving birth feels like a matter of life and death. His indifference during my severe morning sickness and painful contractions only added to my frustration. When we first discovered I was pregnant, George was overjoyed. I vividly remember his excitement when we went shopping for baby supplies together. He was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a dad. However, as time went on, his attitude shifted. By the time I reached the stable phase of my pregnancy, he had become noticeably distant. It might have been because work was particularly demanding, but I wished he would be more attentive and caring. Despite these feelings, I've managed to get through each day. Even today, a day past my due date, George left for work with his usual demeanor. Despite my frustrations, I focused on the well-being of our baby and managed to see him off with a calm expression. About an hour later, I began experiencing what felt like labor pains. I called the hospital, but they advised me to wait since my contractions were still spaced apart. I packed my hospital bag and tried to rest while keeping an eye on the time. By the afternoon, the contractions became more frequent, so I took a taxi to the hospital. I attempted to call George, but he didn't answer, so I sent him an email before admitting myself. Since my in-laws were at work, I couldn't rely on them for support. From that point on, all I could focus on was enduring the intense pain. It was excruciating, and I felt utterly alone and anxious, nearly passing out from the discomfort several times. George finally arrived at the hospital in the evening, but to my dismay, he seemed to have been drinking. Really? Of all days? When I mentioned I was in labor, he brushed it off, saying, "I had a sudden drinking party, but I only had one beer." He seemed almost proud, as if having just one beer was something to be commended. It drove me crazy. What? Even one beer is still drinking? You reek of alcohol. Don't come near me like this. Just leave. Between the sharp belly itches and the stench of alcohol, I could hardly think straight. Fortunately, a nurse came in and promptly escorted George out, leaving me alone once more. I spent a restless night, and before I knew it, morning had arrived. It seemed the baby was about to be born soon. After moving to the delivery room and waiting for a while, George eventually came in, looking like he had sobered up. I wanted to ask, what does he want now? But I was too exhausted to even speak. Finally, my son was born safely. Despite the near overwhelming pain, I felt a profound relief when I heard my baby's healthy cry. When the nurse handed my son to George, he hesitated but took him in his arms. As I vaguely thought, "So he's a dad now," George made an outrageous comment. "He doesn't look like me at all. Whose kid is this?" Saying that, George handed our son back to the nurse. I was stunned and glared at him, unable to make sense of what was happening. "Get out," I said firmly, despite the pain making it difficult to speak. George left the room without a word. What was he thinking? How could he act like this? I was too angry and drained to dwell on his behavior, focusing instead on the situation at hand. My son was taken to the nursery, and I was moved to my room. Though I was seething, exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell asleep without realizing it. The days flew by as I focused on caring for my son during my 5-day hospital stay. George visited occasionally, but since we were in separate rooms, our time together was brief. My mother-in-law came to pick me up when I was discharged, while George reportedly went back to work. She seemed unaware of George's earlier behavior and showered our baby with affection, constantly remarking on how cute he was. My father-in-law, who had left work early, also came by to help. With them looking after our son, I was able to get some much-needed rest. I was deeply grateful for their support. In the evening, while my mother-in-law was preparing dinner, George came home. I greeted him with a welcome back, but he responded coldly and without warmth. As soon as he entered the living room, he pulled an envelope from his bag, completely ignoring our son. With a smirk, he called me over. "Ellie, I need to talk to you." I was already irritated by his demeanor, but what happened next was even more shocking. George pulled out some documents from an envelope and shoved them in my face. "I had it tested. The baby isn't mine, so we're getting a divorce. This proves your affair." I let out a stunned gasp, and my mother-in-law's cooking came to a halt. My father-in-law, who was holding our son, froze in disbelief, staring at George. Despite the stunned silence that filled the room, George looked utterly smug. When my son was born, I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't resemble me at all. Out of curiosity, I decided to secretly have a DNA test done. When the results came in, George insisted we review them together. He handed me the document, which was filled with complex terminology and numbers. I zeroed in on a key sentence. "The tested individual cannot be excluded as the biological father." "George, cannot be excluded means I'm the father, right?" "What? Do you have zero reading comprehension?" George replied with a calm smirk. "If you're not excluded, it means you are the father." George started to panic. "What? No way." As I recalled the events of the birth, my anger flared up again. "So all those accusations were because you suspected me of cheating." I vividly remembered him asking, "Whose kid is this?" when he first saw our newborn son. I placed the document in front of my in-laws, who were livid. "George, how could you do this to Ellie while she was going through so much?" They scolded him. As his parents reprimanded him, George began to make excuses. "Well, the office is full of men, and she often went to drinking parties. She came home late some nights, so naturally, I was concerned." I felt a surge of irritation at George as he glanced at me while speaking. "I reported every drinking party to you, and you even picked me up when I was going to be late, and still, you doubted me." But George continued to act as if he were in the right. "Well, I've read about people raising their partner's child on the internet. A coworker suggested I get a DNA test." "Oh, I see. There's probably no point in discussing this further with him," I thought. "Really? You trusted random stories and the advice of a stranger over me?" My anger flared. "I endured morning sickness and a grueling labor to give birth to a healthy child for you, George, and this is how you repay me." My mother-in-law started to cry, and my father-in-law was visibly enraged. "I can't believe this," he said. As I angrily knocked the documents from George's hand, he fumbled to pick them up, accidentally dropping his bag. To my shock, something unexpected fell out. "What's this?" Inside George's bag was a divorce form. "Are you planning to divorce me suddenly?" George's earlier confidence vanished, leaving him flustered. "No, this isn't, I could no longer tolerate his behavior. You've gone through the effort of preparing divorce papers, and now you're saying you don't want a divorce." I grabbed the divorce papers and tightly gripped a pen. As I prepared to sign, George tried to stop me, but just then, his smartphone rang with an incoming email. My hand paused, a sinking feeling washing over me. When had his behavior and words started to seem so off? It had been strange since summer, after spring had passed. What was this unease? Driven by impulse, I snatched George's phone, holding it away from him as he panicked. I unlocked the screen and was shocked by what I saw. I read aloud. "Have you filled out the divorce papers yet? It wasn't your child anyway, right? Claim alimony from your wife and let's go on a lavish trip." What's this? My intuition had been right. I was puzzled by your sudden accusations of cheating and wondered where they came from. Could it be that you're the one who's been unfaithful? That's why you suspected me of cheating, isn't it? George's face went pale. Who is this woman? Could she be a new employee or something? He must have become the point of contact for new hires this spring and got close to her. I continued calmly. That makes sense. Your behavior changed because you were cheating on me. That's why you were coming home late and claiming to work on holidays. Probably just going on dates. Seeing that George remained silent, it seemed my assumptions were hitting close to home. Hearing this, my father-in-law's anger flared up again. Is this true? As George avoided eye contact, my father-in-law's fist connected with his face. Turning to me, my father-in-law bowed deeply. Ellie, I'm truly sorry for my foolish son. George, now bowing alongside his father, was subjected to a stern interrogation. You should be the one apologizing. Tell the whole truth. The woman George had been involved with matched my suspicions. She was a younger employee who had transferred from another branch, and since George was responsible for her training, their affair had developed from there. It turned out she was also married, though she didn't have children. Stunned, I quickly completed the divorce papers and thrust them at George. Sign these immediately. Ellie, I'm sorry. Please reconsider. I admit my mistakes, George pleaded. I could only regard him with cold detachment. No, I won't reconsider. I don't need someone who abandons me in my time of need. I don't want to see your face again. Since you doubted our son's paternity, you don't need to be a part of his life either. However, I will be seeking child support. With my father-in-law as a witness, George filled out the divorce papers. We also discussed alimony and child support. During this time, my mother-in-law, who had taken our son away temporarily, returned. She silently handed something to George. Confused, he opened it to find an old photo album. Inside was a picture of a baby who bore a striking resemblance to our son. It looks just like him. There's no way he's not your child, my mother-in-law said coldly. These are pictures from when George was born. He resembles our son exactly. George's shock was evident, but he doesn't look anything like me. He began to make excuses. At that point, my patience snapped. If a newborn baby looked exactly like you as an adult, wouldn't that be unsettling? Clearly from the photo, it's obvious that this child is yours. No, it's not that. It's just that everyone kept saying it. I believed it from the start, George stammered. Liar. If you truly believed it, you wouldn't have demanded a DNA test. You're always shifting the blame. Take responsibility for your actions. You neglected your pregnant wife and had an affair. That's a fact. And now you're letting your mistress sway you, ducking your wife, and conducting a DNA test on your own child. Is there any sincerity in any of this? No. I was suffering while you were unfaithful. I'm not so generous as to forgive such betrayal. I let loose on George without pausing for breath. Despite his constant apologies, I couldn't find it in me to forgive him, and we proceeded with the divorce. The rumors about George's affairs quickly spread at work, making his job increasingly difficult and leading to a series of mistakes. Consequently, he was transferred to a different branch in Nebraska. I considered moving back to my parents' house, but given the challenges of traveling long distances postpartum, I decided to stay in George's now empty family home. My son is growing up healthy here, and I'm settling in well. George's parents gave him a severe reprimand, and he's been using his savings to pay alimony, closely monitored by my father-in-law. He makes his payments every month. We also pursued damages from the woman he had the affair with. Her husband discovered the betrayal, leading to their divorce. I heard she's now working at a bar. Though George was a foolish husband, I am deeply grateful for the support of my in-laws. They've been a strong presence in my life as I raise our son. I'm very satisfied